Have you ever run into an idea that just breaks your brain a little bit? Something that feels like it can't possibly be true, but at the same time, you know it is? Well, that's what we're talking about today, the paradox. These are those incredible moments where our simple logic just hits a wall. And what's so fascinating is that we find them in the deepest parts of our faith and, weirdly enough, in the hardest, most fundamental parts of our science.
So let's just dive right into the deep end with a classic one. This question has kept theologians up at night for centuries. Scripture tells us God is constant, that he's unchanging. But then you read other parts and it really seems like he changes his mind. So how on earth can both of those things be true? This isn't just a simple mistake in the text. It's a perfect example of a divine paradox, and it forces us to ask what we really understand about the character of God.
So does that make God contradictory? Well, hang on. What if we're looking at it all wrong? What if that apparent contradiction isn't a problem we're supposed to solve, but maybe it's a doorway into a much bigger, deeper understanding? That's the journey we're going to go on today. To see these tensions not as flaws in the logic, but as features of a reality that is way more profound than we usually give it credit for.
Okay, but before we can really wrestle with these massive paradoxes in faith and science, we need to make sure we understand the main tool we're using. So let's get on the same page. What is a paradox, really? Because trust me, how we define it changes everything.
Right. So a paradox isn't just some clever riddle or a word game. It's a statement that on the surface seems completely self-contradictory, impossible. But if you stick with it, if you really wrestle with it, it starts to unlock a deeper layer of truth that simple, straightforward logic just can't get to. It's less of a logical mistake and more like a key to a hidden room.
And this brings up a super important distinction. You see, a logical fallacy, that's like a broken bridge. It's just a mistake in our thinking, and we need to fix it or get rid of it. But a paradox? That's totally different. It's a real tension between two things that are both true, and we're invited to just hold them both at the same time. You could almost say it's not a bug in our logic, it's a feature of reality itself.
All right, so now that we've got a handle on what a paradox is, let's see how this plays out in the Bible. It turns out this kind of upside-down paradoxical logic isn't just some occasional quirk, it's like a core operating principle of how God works in the world. And here's one of the biggest ones you'll see again and again, the paradox of power. In our world it's pretty simple, right? Power goes to the strongest, the biggest, the wealthiest. But Scripture just flips that whole idea on its head. It says that real, lasting divine strength actually shows up in the most unexpected places, through weakness, through inadequacy, through dependence.
Just look at David and Goliath. This isn't just a cute underdog story. It's a masterclass in this divine reversal. On one side, you've got Goliath. This guy is over 9 feet tall, wearing more than 125 pounds of armor. He's a literal giant. And on the other side, you've got David, a shepherd kid, the youngest son, who was so unimportant his own dad didn't even bother calling him in from the fields. The odds were absurd, and that was the whole point. The victory had to come from God, because there was no other possible explanation.
The Apostle Paul says it about as clearly as you can. He was begging God to take away this thorn in his flesh, some kind of painful limitation in his life. And God's answer was basically no. Why? Because God's power doesn't just add to our own strength, it actually works best in the empty space left by our weakness. And that's when Paul had this huge revelation. For when I am weak, then I am strong. His weakness wasn't a liability. It was the very thing that made room for God's strength.
Okay, now let's pivot. Because you might be thinking, all right, that's all ancient scripture and theology. But what if I told you that when we look at the absolute bedrock of our physical universe, scientists have stumbled onto the exact same kind of paradoxical logic?
For hundreds of years, the smartest people on the planet argued about what light actually is. Is it a particle, like a tiny little bullet? Or is it a wave, like a ripple in a pond? Isaac Newton said particle. Thomas Young proved it was a wave. They couldn't both be right, could they? Well, the absolutely bizarre answer from quantum mechanics is, yeah, both.
And this is where things get really weird. It turns out that when scientists design an experiment to look for a wave, light behaves like a wave. But when they set up an experiment to look for a particle, light behaves like a particle. It's not one or the other. It's somehow, mysteriously, both at the exact same time. Its fundamental nature seems to change depending on how we decide to look at it.
Which leads us to the central mind-bending question of quantum mechanics. And doesn't that question sound familiar? How can an unchanging God also change his mind? How can someone be both fully human and fully divine? This both-and way of thinking isn't just some theological quirk.
It seems to be literally woven into the fabric of the cosmos.
So what on earth are we supposed to do with this? We've got these incredibly deep, foundational paradoxes in both scripture and in science. Is that really just a coincidence? Or are they both pointing toward the same unified reality?
You know, this isn't even a new idea. Way back in the 16th century, the scientist Francis Bacon had this amazing thought. He said God basically wrote two books for us to read, the book of Scripture and the book of nature. And since they both have the same author, they can't actually contradict each other in the end. Any apparent contradiction, any paradox, is just an invitation for us to look closer and read more carefully.
When you just step back and look at the big picture, the shared patterns are kind of hard to ignore. Both our faith and our science, when you push them to their absolute limits, they run into a reality that just refuses to fit into our neat little either-or boxes. They both show us that the world is richer, stranger, and so much deeper than our everyday logic can handle.
And that leaves us with one final, pretty provocative thought. We usually see a paradox as a dead end, right? A logical wall that we've smashed into. But what if that's completely wrong? What if a paradox isn't there to stop our thinking, but to invite us to think in a completely new way? What if it's not a wall, but a door inviting us to go deeper, to trust more, and to discover that the reality we live in is more beautiful and more coherent than we ever could have imagined?